Pierre Poilievre, even though he didn't win the election, but he seemed to galvanize a lot of young people in this country who see some possibility in the Conservative Party.
Absolutely, because he's talking about how bad things are for people, and the NDP's not talking about that. The NDP, for example, Jagmeet will say we have to tax the rich as sort of the last point in 12 points of policy. If I was running that campaign, I would say the reason for the housing crisis is the massive profits of private capital, that all they care about is making money. They don't care about providing housing.
Canada's New Democratic Party suffered a crushing blow in the 2025 federal election. Not only did Jagmeet Singh finish a disappointing third in his British Columbia riding and announce his resignation as party leader, but the NDP was reduced to a paltry 7 seats and lost official party status. They will now be the 4th largest party in the House of Commons, behind the winning centrist Liberals, the right-wing Conservatives, and the Quebec Sovereigntist Party, Bloc Québécois. The Social Democratic NDP is now at a crossroads and is expected to begin a protracted period of debate and soul-searching about its future, and not for the first time in its history. In the coming days, weeks, months, and possibly years, its members will have to determine what the party is, what it wants, and how it plans to achieve its goals. One of the key questions the NDP must answer is the role social movements should play within the party. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Judy Rebick has lived her life at the intersection of community activism and political party organizing. Born on August 15, 1945, on the cusp of the baby boom, Rebick has been at the forefront of Canada's most significant social movements for the last 60 years, whether it has been as a student activist in the 1960s, an organizer and journalist with socialist revolutionary groups in the 1970s, spokesperson for pro-choice groups and ally of abortion rights advocate Dr. Henry Morgentaler in the 1980s, president of Canada's leading feminist organization and progressive commentator and TV host in the 1990s, writer and academic in the 2000s. Throughout that time, she has also been either associated with or at the center of numerous groupings and organizations determined to reform and transform the NDP. Whether as a member of the Waffle Movement, the Campaign for an Activist Party, the New Politics Initiative, or the Leap Manifesto. And so, given her history, there's no better person in Canada to assess the current state of the NDP and to consider a path forward than her. Judy Rebick, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to it, but I'll do my best.
Well, Judy, you've led quite a life, and you've actually experienced a lot of different elections, over the last 60 years. What is your response to what happened on election night?
I can't deny that there's a little relief that the Liberals won and not the Conservatives, because I think if the Conservatives won, we'd really be in trouble. But I'm very sad about the NDP's devastation. I mean, it was devastating. I think it's probably the worst election results in the party's history. It's very sad because the overall reason was the fear of Poilievre and Trump. But there's also a shift in the class support for the NDP and an age. And that's what's the most worrisome for me, because you have more working class people, union people going to the Conservatives and more young men. And I think that's very troubling.
Can you explain what happened to the NDP and how it happened?
Okay. Well, that's a very long story. But I'd say what happened is that the bureaucrats, the staff, they'd be angry at me calling them bureaucrats, but I think that's what they are. The NDP got more and more into the professional work of politics, reading the polls, reading this, reading that, and not organizing.
So too many consultants.
The party professionalized, started to work like the other parties. The support for the membership at a grassroots level, which was always the power of the party, was gone. And not only that, but the staff made it their business to get rid of any activist. It looked to me like they were getting rid of the best activists they had. Sarah Jama in Ontario, these terrific activists, and they're just rejected in every way possible, and they could be the future of the party. So I think the whole strategy of relying on professionalizing the party and not relying on the movement. Martin Lukács has a new book out on Polyev, and he points out that the right learned from the NDP how to organize, and the NDP forgot how to organize.
But is that new? Haven't those tensions existed within the New Democratic Party for the better part of, 50 years? That's not a new development, is it?
Not at all. They expelled the Waffle, more or less expelled the Waffle for the same reasons, right? They were too radical. That's the same. I think that's the biggest mistake the party ever made, was driving the Waffle out of the party, because that was the whole youth radicalization, and the party's reaction was to push them out.
And explain what the Waffle was, because you were a member of the Waffle.
I was, yeah. The Waffle was a left-wing youth movement, a socialist, if you want, a socialist current in the NDP. It was mostly young people. It was led by
Mel Watkins
and Jim Laxer. The amazing thing about the Waffle at the time was they also had female leadership, which nothing else ever did, or hardly anything. And it was socialist and Canadian nationalist. This is the interesting thing, is one of their main slogans was, "We don't want to be a branch plant of the United States." And therefore, they really focused on not doing what we did, ultimately, later became called free trade, which was integrating our economy with the United States. An independent socialist Canada was their slogan. And it was mostly young people, and it was a very vibrant group. It got tremendous support in the party, but always the party saw it as a priority to drive them out. But still, they didn't go after the activism itself. In the last, 20 years, and it's actually since Jack Layton, and I love Jack Layton. He was a good friend of mine, wonderful person. But once Jack became leader of the party, he moved toward professionalizing the party, and that's, I think, what caused its downfall.
Going back to the Waffle, what did the Waffle want the NDP to become? What did it want it to be in the early 1970s?
It wanted to be a democratic socialist party. In its constitution, it said it was socialist, but it wasn't really socialist. In order to be socialist, it had to develop the Canadian economy so we can be independent from the United States and not rely on them for everything. Of course, in retrospect, it was pretty visionary, right? Given what we're facing right now. And they were feminist, which was really unusual. In the early 1970s, political parties were not pro-feminist at all, hardly had any women involved.
So the Waffle, of course, was a movement, and there's always been some reluctance within the NDP, certain elements of the NDP, to embrace some of the social movements that animate the work of progressive activists in this country. Can you talk about that historic tension that's existed between a party that wants to sometimes distance itself from social movements?
Yeah, this is the fundamental contradiction of the NDP, which is the movement versus the party, right? And in the New Politics Initiative, which was the next big attempt to change the party.
That you were at the center of.
That's right. I started it with Jim Stanford. Jim and I were walking together on some protest or other. I can't remember what it was for. And we came up with this idea of a party, and we wanted a new party. That's how we proposed it, a new party on the left. That change was allying with the labor movement. And this was the time of the anti-globalization movement.
In the early 2000s.
Yes. And so we proposed a new party that would unite the NDP and the Greens, because that was already showing as a problem, especially with our first past the post system. Start a new party that would have a close relationship with the social movement. I use the example now of Bolivia, where Evo Morales had what he called a council of social movements, which in the case of Bolivia were mostly indigenous nations. And he would consult that council at the same time as he would consult his own cabinet before making decisions. And I think that's a really interesting model to look at. But in any case, we really organized very well. I have to say, we organized meetings across the country, every city. It was really exciting. But as usual, the party leadership did two things. One, they pretended that they would accept all our proposals, and they got their union friends to mobilize people to vote against us, and that's how we were defeated. And unfortunately, Jack Layton, who agreed with us on everything, or said he did at the time, didn't want to support the NPI because he was considering a leadership bid, right? And I understood that, fair enough. You don't identify with a faction of the party if you really want to be the leader. But he didn't support us. When he began as leader of the opposition, he really did listen to the NPI. Things like he spoke at anti-war demonstrations and stuff like that. He changed his direction because, of course, the people who most influence you when you're in politics are other politicians and the staff, and you lose that vibrancy of the support from the movement.
But maybe his argument might be that he needed to be pragmatic, that if he were to embrace the social movements, embrace their approach to politics, that he could end up alienating a good chunk of the Canadian population. And his goal was to gain power, and he didn't do a bad job of it. In 2011, he becomes the official opposition leader. For the first time in Canadian history, the NDP was really challenging for power under Jack Layton.
Absolutely. But I would argue that it was for two reasons. One is Jack was amazing. I've never seen anything like it. You'd be in an airport with Jack, and politicians, they're in an airport, they'll say, hello, how are you? Nice to meet you, that kind of thing. Jack was so into people. He'd sit at the bar and yak with people who were at the bar and discuss things. He was just a really magical person. And people loved him. Even in Quebec, they loved him. Jack was really a remarkable leader in that way. He just really connected with people. And he was also good in the media. But I'm not persuaded that it would have made any difference to the popularity of the NDP if he had been closer to the social movements, if he hadn't have broken that connection. I think the result of it, though, was devastating in the long run, even if it worked in that election.
Why devastating?
Well, look at where we are. The NDP vote completely collapsed. It went to the Liberals, and we don't know for sure, but it also looked like it went to the Conservatives, some of it.
But that's on the federal level. On the provincial level, the NDP has had some success. We know that David Eby is a premier of BC right now. He won a second term. Wab Kinew is the NDP leader of Manitoba, and many people regard Wab Kinew as arguably being the most popular political leader in the country right now. Some have touted him as being a future prime minister. So the NDP has managed to have success at the provincial level. Why not at the federal level? What's the difference?
Well, the difference is the system, right? At the provincial level, people are willing to take a risk at a way that they aren't at the federal level for some reason. And, it's also the first past the post system. I don't know how we can ever change this system. And in this case, in this election, it wouldn't have made any difference at all to have a first past the post, except that what happened here were out of fear, people voted Liberal rather than NDP because they wanted to make sure that Poilievre didn't get in. That's part of what happened in this election. And that wouldn't happen if we didn't have a first past the post system. Why are people willing to risk it? Provincial politics are just really different than federal politics. I don't fully understand how that works myself. Maybe you have a better idea than I do. But when they get in there, the pressure on them is always to adapt to the system and not to change things too much, or you get into trouble.
Judy, maybe the fundamental question is, what is the NDP, the federal NDP, for?
Well, that's a very good question, I think it's so that we don't get into the kind of dysfunctional two-party system that they have in the United States, which has deteriorated into basically throwing rocks and, in the U.S., who knows, someday throwing bombs at each other, and what Parliament has deteriorated into in the last year, which is just throwing rocks, just attack dogs on both sides, and nothing gets done. By having other parties, not having a two-party system, the other parties can stand up to stop that kind of dynamic. Most of the improvements that we've seen in our social programs has come from NDP pressure.
But I guess the question, Judy, is that enough? Is the goal to influence policy, to shape the discourse, to help bring about things like dental care, like pharmacare, or is the goal to win power and to govern?
You say that as an either-or. I don't think it's an either-or. I really don't. I think that what we need is a social democratic party that, yes, is interested in power, but isn't willing to give up its ideas and principles for power, because it understands that you have to change capitalism. I personally think you have to overthrow capitalism, but I'm not requiring that from the NDP. But you have to fundamentally change capitalism. And right now, we're in such a mess that you have to do it the way FDR did it, like really a big effort to change the way that capitalism is working, because it's not working for the majority of people. at all anymore.
But Judy, you're saying it's not working for the vast majority of people. We hear young people lamenting the fact that they can't really afford to live. They can't afford to live in our cities. They're never going to own a home. There's a lot of distress out there. And yet, a lot of these young people are not going to the NDP.
Why would they?
The NDP doesn't seem to be providing them with a vision, a kind of a plan for the future. And Pierre Poilievre, even though he didn't win the election, but he seemed to galvanize a lot of young people in this country who see some possibility in the Conservative Party.
Absolutely, because he's talking about how bad things are for people, and the NDP's not talking about that. The NDP, for example, Jagmeet will say we have to tax the rich as sort of the last point in 12 points of policy. If I was running that campaign, I would say the reason for the housing crisis is the massive profits of private capital, that all they care about is making money. They don't care about providing housing. So, number one, we have a massive wealth tax, and that is what we run the campaign on. Anybody making over this amount of money, we tax them 50%. Any housing that's empty, I mean, I'm sitting here looking at a condo that has half of the apartments have been empty for like a couple of years now. The government should give the power, I don't know how you can do that, but give the power to take over those housing and put people in them. Like, what we need is transformational proposals. You know, Poilievre doesn't have transformational proposals, but he's good at identifying what the problem is and saying he's going to fix it, even though he's not going to fix it, he's going to make it worse. But the NDP does have ideas about how to fix it. They just don't run on those ideas. They try to be a little better than the Liberals. That's all they've been doing for the last, 10 years anyway, maybe more than that. And that's not going to work because now we need fundamental change. It should be the time that a left-wing party can run with that and really get a lot of support, but they're not doing it.
Is the NDP still the party of Labour? And if not, what does it need to do in order to become that?
The NDP doesn't identify itself anymore as the party of Labour, and I'm not sure if it should be. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I think that's part of the discussion. And that's the other issue. Like, if the NDP is the party of Labour, the Labour movement has not been very active in this campaign. I mean, we hardly ever see union leaders in the media at all anymore. In previous election campaigns, they would be out in the streets. And they are, the CLC's organizing, but they're mostly organizing online, as far as I can see. And so the labor movement is not what it used to be. It doesn't play as big a role as it used to. And it's also not organizing. A lot of workers who are self-employed or gig workers are not organizing the labor movement. Except for Unifor, there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in organizing them. I think what we need is a cross-issue movement now that brings everybody together to fight for human rights and democracy, because that's what's at stake here.
You were involved with the Waffle Movement in the early 1970s. You were involved with the New Politics Initiative in the early 2000s. You were also involved with the Leap Manifesto, which came to the fore in 2015, like 10 years ago now. Are there things that the NDP can learn from what the Leap Manifesto was proposing?
Absolutely. I mean, the Leap Manifesto was proposing a new approach which said that climate change has to be at the center of our preoccupations, as well as socialism, or a more socialist society, and connecting the environmental movement with the social justice movements. And this is key because, in the old days, like 20, 30 years ago, the environment movement was somewhere else from the social justice movements and didn't even talk to each other. Now people are trying to organize, and there are efforts to try and bring together the environmental movement and the social justice movements. There's people working on that now, and I think that's really, really important. And that was the visionary part of the Leap Manifesto, was saying that we have to bring these movements together, these issues together, and figure out a way forward that will not destroy the planet and that will make life fairer for working people.
The Leap Manifesto was also talking about Indigenous movements.
Yes. Well, you can't do that without the complete involvement, in fact, leadership of the Indigenous movements. I think it's fair to say the NDP has been quite weak on Indigenous issues, with the exception in Manitoba, as we see. Wab-Kinew is showing us how you can integrate the demands of Indigenous people into running a government. I mean, I think Wab-Kinew is really showing us a different kind of leadership that recognizes the importance of Indigenous movements, and I'm not in touch with it enough to know about his relationship with the other movements that are there, but certainly the Indigenous movements, which are very strong in Manitoba, of course. And also there's very strong feminist leadership, Indigenous movements in Manitoba.
The NDP is in a bad spot right now federally. Just 7 seats.
I was going to say that's the understatement of the year.
Well, sure. Well, they're looking for a new leader, new kind of leadership. If you were asked to be a consultant, and you criticize some of the consultants,
Yeah.
if you were asked to be an advisor at this point for the federal NDP, what is the path forward? What would you say is the blueprint for the NDP to regain relevance on the national scene?
Well, first I would say if I were in a leadership position in the NDP now, I would get together people who were critics in the past, like me, like Naomi Klein, like Avi Lewis, like who ran for the
NDP.
He ran, yes, and he continues to be very engaged, right? So Avi Lewis, I think, is a key person. I think Wab Kinew is a key person. I think Nenshi is a key person. Now, Nenshi is someone who's never been in the NDP, right? But I mean, a guy
who's now the leader of the NDP in Alberta.
That's right. And this guy is an amazing guy because he was never in a party. He was always very left-wing. He's queer, too. And he's a person of color. And he was the mayor of Calgary all this time. Okay, so you tell me, if we have our normal prejudices about, who's right-wing and who's left-wing, how we manage that. So I think he's a very creative guy, very, very inspiring guy. And get together people who are currently leading social movements and talk to them about what's needed now, right? What they see in a party. Because I think if you just go for a regular leadership race in the same old, it may or may not come out better. I think what's needed is, Alexa McDonough did this. She had a big conference in which they invited social movement leaders to speak to the party about what the party should be doing. Of course, they didn't listen, right? So if you're going to do that, you have to listen. So I think some old-fashioned organizing like that is required. So you invite leaders of movements, leaders of the NDP who have been successful across the country, and union leaders, and talk about what we need now to win back. I mean, step outside of party politics. It's very troubling that young men in particular are thinking the conservatives are the ones who have answers for them. This is what troubles me more than anything, more than how weak the NDP is that the conservatives have somehow managed to convince young men that they serve their interests, which they totally do not. And so the right is organizing in a way the left isn't on the ground. It's very troubling. And, Polyev is a populist. Now we're going to see that debate in the Conservative Party, the traditionalists versus the populists, right? Or you could say the progressive conservatives versus the alt-right. So you're going to see the Conservative Party, I think, having a big debate. And I think the NDP has to have that debate. And not just say, oh, well, it was just this election. People were afraid, so they voted Liberal when they usually vote NDP, and they did it out of fear. And the other thing is we have to have more fun,
Judy Rebick, it's great to speak with you. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.